Welcome to Brain Nevas. This is a very special episode of the show because I'm joined by our longtime producer, Ella Coleman, and we're going to be interviewing Jessica Flanigan, who we recently had on the show and was such a wonderful guest that we had to have her back. And it's partly a companion episode to one we've aired a while ago on prostitution with Laurie Watson. And Jess and Laurie co-authored a book together on the topic. So we thought it was about time that we heard the other side of the debate. So, Jess, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Sure. So just start by imagining two people who start dating and have a relationship where it's not the typical boy meets girl scenario. So let's just pull some names out of the hat. The boy will say it's Don, and we'll call the woman, I don't know, Melania. And Don's not a super appealing guy in a lot of ways, but one thing Don has going for him is that he is mega rich, and he's got all of this cool property and real estates and stuff, a lot of influence. And Melania is super interested in that. She's an immigrant. She doesn't really participate much in the formal paid economy right now. And so she's really looking for a path to financial security and stability in her new country. And Don has that. Meanwhile, Melania is beautiful. And Don's not super in it for the love. It's not like he wants to stay up late talking about philosophy or whatever, but he just really wants to be with a beautiful woman. And he would otherwise find it kind of hard to find somebody who was that beautiful, but for the fact that he's so rich. So Don and Melania get together and they just keep on meeting up, and eventually they have a sexual relationship that persists for a long time. In that case, Melania was only interested in spending time with Don and having sex with him because he was really rich and he could provide her a pathway to financial stability. And Don's only interested in Melania because she's beautiful. She's supermodel gorgeous. Is there anything wrong with that relationship? Do we think that that relationship is problematic? Probably a lot of people would say yes. But now we'll introduce another character into the story. Call this guy Sam. And Uncle Sam is I hate this. I hate this because I think that Melania should only want to date Don for pure and good reasons related to his sparkling personality and sharp wit, commitment to civic service or whatever. And Don should only want to date Melania because of her intrinsic goodness or whatever. These are the wrong kinds of reasons for people to have a sexual relationship. I don't like that. Okay. Should Sam then be able to criminalize their relationship, make there be penalties for it, send Melania out of the country, lock up Don and put him in a cage for 15 years? Of course not. What if, though, Don and Melania were a little bit more explicit about their relationship? And it was just a straight up, here's the deal, Melania. I want a beautiful woman to have sex with me. And Melania's great. I'm a beautiful woman, but I'm only going to do it if you pay me $1,000 every time. For some reason, once the relationship becomes a little bit more finely described in that fine-grained way, a bunch of people's intuitions flip. And suddenly they think, oh no, it is the rest of our business about whether or not we take a stand on this kind of relationship. People are getting together all over the internet, all over the world for their own kinds of reasons every single day. But it's just this one kind of relationship that people think is their business to criminalize and prohibit. And I'm arguing it's still none of their business.
So I take it that in your argument for decriminalizing sex work, autonomy plays a central role. So you're suggesting that if someone chooses to sell sex and there's no force and there's no fraud, that choice should not be penalized. But I'd also love to hear more about how you understand autonomy in that context. So, for example, do you think a choice is autonomous as long as there's no direct coercion? Or does it also depend on the range of alternatives someone has access to? So if a person chooses sex work mainly because other forms of work are inaccessible or less viable, is that still fully autonomous in your view? Or does autonomy require a certain, say, baseline of meaningful options?
So you're right. I define autonomy as the absence of force, fraud, and coercion, where coercion is just some kind of threat against your natural rights against interference. It's a pretty minimal view of what that would be. And I think that the choice to sell sex is autonomous in that respect. And then you ask, but what if a person is only selling sex because otherwise they couldn't satisfy their basic needs? So then the question's like, maybe selling sex is kind of like working in a sweatshop where people are only doing it because institutions at a higher level have really let them down. And there's such economic desperation and such need that there's no other choice that a person has that's acceptable to them but for them to sell sex. And I do agree that in some cases that might happen, but that's a reason in favor of respecting people's authority to make that choice, even more so. Because you don't help somebody who's in a desperate circumstance by taking away what they themselves judge to be their best option, especially if you're not replacing it with a better option. So you might look at those situations where a person is selling sex only because of desperation, doesn't seem that voluntary, and think, oh, there should be a universal basic income. Nobody should be in the situation where that's their best option. And sure, advocate for a universal basic income. But until you've achieved that, there's no reason to prohibit selling sex because that's what the person, in the absence of a good social safety net, judges to be their best choice. And then once you have that, say that we have a universal basic income. We did it. Nobody's forced to work in a job that they find really difficult, degrading, or whatever, just because of economic desperation. Well, then, awesome. Then you also shouldn't be banning sex because everybody could just fall back on their basic income. And then there's like no reason to think that the choice isn't sufficiently voluntary. So either way, that's not a reason to prohibit the selling of sex.
So one attack against prostitution is the idea that there's something sacred about the sex, and it's why some people will object to the arrangement between fictional Don and Melania, and they'll say, well, you've sullied this wonderful institution that should only really be done for these, good, virtuous reasons. Should, either you've got a serious relationship where you respect each other's souls, or you're married, and when someone commodifies this product, they devalue it, and on that basis, we have a good reason to prohibit it. The other one might be that women as a group have an interest in criminalizing sex on the basis that it competes with a product that they're trying to sell less overtly. So, as you say, you've got women like Melania who are trying to net rich husbands. And because they have a rare commodity, they're able to provide that service. But if you have a bunch of very good-looking women who are saying, look, I'm not looking for a relationship. You don't have to put a ring on my finger. You can just have the thing that you want, and it's a pay for play. Other women have good reason to say, well, we need to try and regulate that space because it competes with us and makes our lives more difficult. And, they want the state to step in so Uncle Sam can, protect the racket that they've got going.
Okay, so I'm going to take those two possibilities in reverse order because the first one's more general, and so my response will be a more general response. So the second one is maybe this is just a collective action problem among women. And probably, I'm sure there is something to that. A lot of women do oppose the decriminalization and legalization of sex work. And I don't know what their reasons are because those penalties would likely primarily affect other women. And so, we can only hypothesize why women themselves want to advocate for policies that would limit their own bodily rights and freedoms so much. But we see this in a lot of cases. So there's a hypothesis about modesty norms. And if you have norms around modesty where people are, concealing any kinds of signs of sexual availability, that's very beneficial to the women who are the most sexually desirable. Because everybody is sort of competing for the same pool of men, and you've just taken out one way that otherwise less desirable women might be able to make concessions that they didn't want to make in order to compete for the more desirable women. So if all of the women are like, look, we don't want to have sex on the third date, but we got to get it together, sisters, because we hold the line. Because once some of you start defecting and having sex on the first, second, and third date, I'm going to feel pressure to do it too. I understand that if you're like a straight up 10, like a real hottie, like Melania over there, like you might have a reason to think like nobody defect, because that system is one where you're at the top and people aren't competing on different dimensions in order to undercut your like sexual market value. But if you're like a 6 and you're looking to like lock it down, like you might think like, look, I gotta take my chances. It's tough out here for a 6. Like I gotta like wear the short skirt or like signal sexual availability in some way. And so I kind of think like it might be a kind of coordination problem within like the sexual marketplace, but like in so many other marketplaces, the people who are in favor of like tight restrictions on what people can permissibly do tend to be the people who are currently maximally advantaged in the market, and they're trying to sort of maintain those rents for themselves by depleting their competition. And so that's how we do like casual sex and modesty norms in the same way. But that wouldn't mean that we should prohibit women from wearing miniskirts or sleeping with people on the third date or whatever. Even if everybody collectively does have some kind of a preference around that, because I'll also have some people who have a preference to defect nevertheless. And then this kind of gets to the point about the sacredness of sex more generally, which is that for any of these things, we already have a lot of practices in society, like advertising or TV or porn or whatever, that already signal less sacredness around sexual activity. And so there's a philosophical kind of innovation from Nick Bostrom called the reversal test in Toby Ord, where it's like, let's shift the burden of proof. What is it about the current level of prohibition that we would think is optimal, where if we really care about optimizing on the sacredness of sex, we should allow sexual freedom when it comes to advertising or pornography or casual sex or modesty, all of these other shifts in sexual norms, but we should still continue to prohibit prostitution. And so like, what is it that we think that like all of this sexual liberation in the past 200 years, like progress, all to the good, we'd love to see it, but like now we're good, now it's perfect. We shouldn't go any further, but we also shouldn't dial it back and go back to like the Victorian era where like women weren't supposed to show their ankles, right? Like, why would we think that like we're just right when it comes to the distribution of sexual promiscuity in the world?
Do you think the fact that the structure of the market is itself, in most cases, where the buyers are men and the sellers are women, does that pattern seem to reflect a neutral or evenly balanced system? Or does it instead seem to be shaped by like gendered expectations? You know, about like who desires sex, who is expected to provide it, and then who also has the resources to pay for access to it. So like when the market mostly flows in one direction with men purchasing and women selling, can we really think of it as a neutral exchange between equals, or is there sort of an underlying asymmetry built into the structure of the market itself?
I do think that there is an asymmetry, but I don't think that it's that men have more income and wealth. And I think a lot of men who are sex buyers are relatively low income and they're lower in wealth. And partly that's a result of the fact that men who have lower economic status are less likely to be able to find willing sexual partners through the dating marketplace. And so I don't think we should think like, oh, these men have all this money so they can buy sex, but if only women had more money, they'd be buying sex. I don't think women would be buying sex if they had more money. I think that there's just differences, sex-based differences in people's preferences and tastes about what they want to pay for. And so we see that, women spend their money on different kinds of goods and services en masse. And so we wouldn't say, well, women are the primary buyers of mani-pedis, manicure, pedicure. What's going on there? Like, is it just that the women have so much money that they can get their feet polished? Or like, it's like, why would we think that? No, it's like, well, women have a taste for, refining their physical appearance in a certain way. Maybe because of the male gaze, I don't know. But like they have a taste for it, and that's where they're going to spend their money for it because that's where their preference lies. Men have a preference to spend their money, in some cases, on sexual services. I don't think we should think there's anything nefarious about the fact that men and women on average have different preferences. We see that all over the marketplace. That's not just a sex work thing.
Interestingly, in South Korea, you have women who are willing to pay for a boyfriend experience where they're not paying for sex, but they're hiring someone to spend time with them and go shopping with them, go on dates with them, take them out to dinners, because there's a value in, seeming part of a couple, having a sort of alleged intimacy. So yeah, it does seem that the preferences are different, and as you say, these could very well be gendered, but they are the preferences people have, and markets are good at serving preferences. Do you think that the manner in which the market operates matters for regulation? So you can imagine the situation where you've got the pimp who has a bunch of women who work for him, and he takes a percentage of the rake, versus someone who has an OnlyFans account. They're in total control of their time, how much they want to sell for, how frequently they want to do it. There's arguably, no individual who is coercing them into it. Should we have different moral views or different legal views, or should we be agnostic about this and say, well, any kind of sale, it's none of our business?
I don't think in principle there's anything objectionable about having third parties facilitating sex markets, just like anything else. So if you're an artist, you might just directly sell your art to people, like on the side of the road, book a craft fair, whatever. Or you could put your art up on Etsy, and then the online platform Etsy will take a cut of it. Or you could pay a gallery, and then the gallery will take about 40% of whatever the sale is from the gallery, which is like much more than what Etsy would charge. Or you could have an agent, which like very high value artists often will do. And that person will match you to specific clients for like commissioned work. And that person will make their money almost entirely off of just facilitating the sale of your art. Do we think that, artists and some of those economic arrangements are more exploited than artists under other economic arrangements? Not necessarily. It really just depends on, the terms of those relationships and how people are being treated, like any other job. And so sometimes people will think, oh, well, we should criminalize sex trafficking, which is when any third party profits from the sale of a sexual service. But that's an odd way to put it, because we wouldn't think that the artist who has an agent or who makes most of their art for a gallery, it's like art trafficking, like artist trafficking. We wouldn't think that the person who's paying someone else to facilitate the sale of their labor is being trafficked in any other context. And so to characterize those types of arrangements as sex trafficking is so misleading. And it also just distracts from the fact that in other cases, there are third parties who are like literal criminals who are forcing people to labor, either in the sex work industry or agricultural labor, other kinds of industries. There is real human trafficking that happens, which is not voluntary. It's a result of force, fraud, and coercion. And making it seem like just because somebody profits from the sale of your labor that they're trafficking you undermines the moral force of laws that are supposed to be prohibiting the real deal kidnapping type stuff.
So about consumers. Of course, paternalism is always a concern, but should we consider how decriminalization could harm those who buy the sex? So there's research that shows some people develop compulsive patterns with sex or porn in particular, or they keep going back to it even when it starts to harm their relationships, for example, their mental health, or even their physical well-being. Some might even compare it to an addiction, where they keep doing something that harms them because it gives them a short-term reward. And we do sometimes treat certain industries like gambling or drugs as public health risks because they tend to create patterns of harm when they're widely available. So I'm wondering, if we fully decriminalize sex work and it becomes more accessible and normalized, should we also be thinking about just the long-term effects on consumers who might be vulnerable to it?
Yeah, one thing I tried to do in the book, which you don't see a lot in these debates, is really emphasize the value of having access to sex workers from the client perspective. I think people really overlook problems that are male-specific problems in these types of industries. And I think that in general, if there's a demand for sex workers, and then sex workers are meeting that demand with their male clients, that's great, because it indicates that there's a lot of lonely guys out there that just can't find any kind of access to intimacy that's voluntary from a willing partner that they find to be rewarding. And that when you open up these markets to them, they might be able to just have that experience and try. And I think that's like a really valuable thing for them. Now you're worried, like, well, what if like some people, once they have access to that experience, that's all they want to do? And it's like, it's bad for their relationships, or it has a substitution effect where instead of, forming a voluntary romantic partnership with a long-term partner and starting a family, they only see sex workers. Maybe that could happen. I don't know that we should pathologize it and say that it's addiction, because to say that would be to say that one kind of intimacy is better than another kind of intimacy, and that might not be true for everybody. I think people generally are in the best position to know what's best for them when it comes to their relationships. Not to say that they're in a good position to know, but that they're in a better position than any public official would be, or anybody that's like making these decisions on a large scale would be. I also think that about gambling and drugs. Like, I don't think gambling and drugs should be heavily regulated or illegal either for that same reason. Because I think that even when something seems really self-destructed and when people think that they have a higher order preference to stop doing it, we should put a lot of stock in their revealed preference. We should really try to defer to the fact that for a lot of people who use drugs, that genuinely is, in their judgment, the best way that they can spend $50 that weekend. And they might be right that in terms of their own well-being, that is their best option. And a lot of people who are gambling, they're doing it because there's some other kind of like unmet psychological need that they really do think it's worth it for them to try to do that. And same with people who see sex workers a lot. Like, I don't think that even if they say that they're at a higher order level regretting that decision, we might even be a little bit suspicious of that kind of testimony when people say, oh, I'm a sex addict, or like, I can't stop seeing sex workers, because currently seeing a sex worker is stigmatized and it's socially undesirable. So it's socially desirable for people to like disavow that preference. But we should be open to the possibility that that just is their preference for intimacy.
So it seems like the state could have a range of different policies on how to deal with prostitution. The one would be total laissez-faire. So you treat it like any other business, and you don't have any regulations at all. The other one might be that you restrict where prostitution can happen. So you can have like red light districts, and you say that you're perfectly able to sell sex in this area under these conditions at these times, but not elsewhere. And if you do, it's criminal. Or you could have a partial criminalization where you only imprison the customers. So the sort of Nordic model, where the idea is that a woman who is caught selling sex won't be prosecuted, but that the man will be. And then the third is what I think we find in most places, which is that it's illegal for both parties. And so I wonder if you think the state has reason to pick one model over another. One of the arguments in favor of, let's say, criminalization or regulation is that there are certain social harms associated with it. And so you might think, for example, there's a reason why you might want to restrict where you can have nightclubs and bars. You might think that it's okay to have marijuana sold in some areas, but you don't want it right next door to a school. And that there's a sort of, not necessarily the activity itself, but the other activity that it will bring in could be dangerous. And so that seems like a reason to regulate. Or you can take the view, well, punish the illegal bit when it happens, but the non-legal bit, don't blame it.
So my view is that sex work should just be treated like any other industry, like massage therapy, or dentistry. And so in some cases there are occupation-specific, like occupational health and safety guidelines that Lori talks about, and she thinks like it would be impossible to be compatible with OSHA if you were a sex worker. And you could have industry-specific kind of carve-outs like that. I'm in principle even against those, because I think that there should be private self-governance within the industry, private certification, rather than relying on the government to be the certifier of like safety and quality. I don't think that we need the government to do that. I think you could have like a good housekeeping seal of approval on brothels, or private licensing for sex workers. That could be fine. That would be adequate. But if I want to say, we should just make sex work like any other industry, other industries do have some kinds of industry-specific regulations. And so that's kind of how it is in New Zealand, where there's like general workplace protections, labor protections that are going to apply to sex workers as well as other workers. The Nordic model, which is what Lori favors, that takes it way too far, because that includes criminal penalties for the sex buyers. And then that backfires in all sorts of ways. For example, it changes the demographic mix of the sex buyers so that they're more likely to be people who are criminals, because they're people who are like less attentive to like legal restrictions more generally. And that's why they're illegally purchasing sex. And so it makes sex work more dangerous and difficult for the workers, even if it's on behalf of the workers, to try to limit the market. That said, there's just a sliding scale, which is from my like most preferred option, which is that it's fully deregulated, no real regulations at all, down to kind of regulated like other industries, zoning laws. Then you have Laurie's Nordic model to full criminalization. The more burdensome and punitive the state's approach to sex work becomes, the more you will shrink the market. And so if you're somebody who just thinks, I don't like sex work, I just don't want there to be any of it, it is true that as you make it more burdensome, there will be less of it. And if you think that there's some proportion of sex work that's going to involve crime or mistreatment or something bad, expanding the market, which is what I favor, will expand the net number of people who are subject to those types of risks, even if it doesn't expand the proportion, even if it even reduces the proportion potentially. Like, we just don't know like how that trade-off is going to go. And so that's sort of the kind of fine-tuning question about institutional design, is like, how many regulations can you tolerate in order to get some kind of a safety benefit, and I think to expand the market as much as you possibly can, because I think that everybody who has an interest in paying for and selling sex should have the right to do it. But if you don't want to expand the market, then you're going to be way more favorable to having way more regulations, to making that trade-off in a different way.
If sex work is to be treated like other forms of legal labor, should it be advertised like any other job with, billboards, pop-ups, even influencer deals?
Oh, I think advertising is just free speech. And so there's all sorts of advertising that I don't think it's my favorite thing to see on the side of the road in terms of billboards or whatever. But I don't think that there should be any law that censors it necessarily. I just think the government's not in a good position to call what kind of speech is permissible and what kind of speech isn't permissible. Some people think that advertising should be subject to different standards than ordinary speech, but I don't think there's any principled way to draw a line between commercial speech and, for example, freedom of the press, or artistic speech, because there's movies that have a lot of sexually explicit content, and that's artistic speech. In the state of Oregon, stripping is considered free speech because it's naked dance is kind of artistic expression, and that falls within their free speech doctrine in the state. I think that's the right call. I just think that if you try to draw a line around different kinds of speech, you're going to either be really ad hoc in a way that's just going to excessively punish people because the state perfectionistically doesn't like them, or you're going to just rule out huge categories of art and media, which would be terrible.
So a lot of people hold the intuition that we ought to shield children from access to sexual content. And if we are advertising sex work at that level, it would be hard to shield children from it. And your example of movies is great, but there are ratings only 18-year-olds or older can go see it. So I'm wondering how that might factor in.
Yeah, so I have kids, and there's all sorts of media that I don't let them watch. And it is so hard to prevent your kids from seeing inappropriate content, especially once they get phones or if you have a TV. It's so tricky. We are already living in that world. That's not a situation where it's your kids will only be exposed to the possibility that people are selling sex if there's a billboard outside that's advertising a brothel. I mean, you can already, in Richmond, Virginia, advertise gentlemen's clubs, which is a sale of sexual services, Victoria's Secret, lingerie stores. All of that advertising already exists, and then the whole internet is already out there. So if you're worried about protecting children from seeing sexually explicit content, the toothpaste is already out of the tube. Parents are already facing that challenge, and there's no way walking it back, and we're just doing our best. I would say, don't get your kid a phone. That's the solution. Not let's empower a giant government censorship state, but just don't buy your children iPhones.
So I remember chatting to a stripper once who was stripping to pay her way through law school, and paid her way through law school quite well. Started her first job as a sort of legal clerk, and after 2 months, quit in disgust. She said, "I cannot believe how exploitative this industry is and how poorly it pays. I made so much more money as a stripper with better hours, So I wonder about this push Ella's case. Let's say, there's a job fair at your kid's school, and you have, the lawyers and the doctors and the dentists, and then you have the prostitutes. And they say all the rest of these other industries are going to take an enormous amount of time and expense to study the degrees and get certified, and it's going to take a long time before you make money. Start working for us at 16 and you are going to be rolling in money. A lot of you are looking at all these job fairs because you want to make a good living, you want to be able to look after your family. Well, let me tell you, this is the best career you could possibly have. Would anyone have a good reason to object to the prostitution sort of desk at the job fair? Is it the kind of thing where you can say, well, all the things that you've said are true, you will earn a good living, maybe enough people become prostitutes and the price comes down, but there's some sense in which I don't want this to be a career advertised to my kid?
I think that part of it is like there's a kind of vague threshold about when people can consent to sex. So I think that some people will have an older age threshold. But yeah, by 18, I think like if you can go join the military and like fight in a war and kill or be killed, I think that that's like a pretty safe place to say that you can sell sex for money. And so let's put it at the senior year job fair. People are 18. When I was in high school, military recruiters would come to the cafeteria in my Midwestern high school, and it was shortly after 9/11, and recruit 18-year-old boys to go fight in Afghanistan at the time. And so at that point, the point that we're allowing that, which is like, potentially extremely immoral, in my view, for people to be fighting in an unjust war, I think that you could let them make their own sexual decisions about their own body for whatever reasons they want. And so there shouldn't be an objection to a greater extent than there's an objection for military recruiters showing up at the high school to do that kind of stuff. Part of the issue is that sex work is currently so stigmatized. But imagine people going to the job fair and saying, I'm a ballerina and I went to Juilliard and now I use my body to bring people pleasure through like my own dancing and expression. Everybody would be like, we love that ballerina that went to Juilliard. And then your friend who's a stripper shows up and she's like, I also do the exact same thing and they didn't have to pay to go to Juilliard. And they bring way more pleasure to way more people through my artistic expression. And then everybody's like, we don't like that. Like, why not? Like, get it, girl. That's amazing. Like, that's a great thing to do. And so I think a lot of it's just our own kind of hangups around sexual propriety. But if you look at what other jobs are doing, like I personally have no idea how anybody can be a dentist, because it's like every day you're just like putting your hands in other people's mouths, just like over and over and over again, and just like touching their bodies in this way where it's just like what the things that they see. And so like I get it how like people are like grossed out by sex work in some ways, because that's how I feel about dental work. It's like I don't know how they do it, but like what a great world that we have people who are willing to do that every day. Like, yes, like couldn't be me, but but I think that if the dentist goes to the career fair, it is like every single day I'm seeing like 30 mouths some days, just like hands in them, just going to town, 30 mouths. That's what I'm doing. Like, I feel like we could imagine a bizarro world where that was seen as like really intimate and kind of gross. And then everybody would be like, oh my God, I couldn't imagine my kid just handling 30 mouths every day. Ugh, like, like, so I do think that's part of the reaction about the job fair example, is that we have like sexual purity intuitions that we don't have around other kinds of bodily services. But that's like unjustified in my view. Sorry to the dentists that are listening, but like, couldn't be me, just saying.
Should we apply labor justice principles to sex work? So like minimum wage, benefits, unionization, and also just maybe a disanalogy between the two is in most markets, like if we regret a purchase or change our minds, we can return the product. But in sex work, even if everything is consensual, what's exchanged can't be undone or taken back in the same way. So would this make that kind of market different?
No, we should not apply the labor justice principles you mentioned to sex work, because we shouldn't apply them to anything. Because I don't think there should be minimum wage laws or maximum hour laws or anything like that, because I just think it's people's own occupational freedom. And I think that minimum wage laws are similar to the example I gave earlier of the dating marketplace, whereas like people who have comparatively more advantages at that in those markets benefit from the regulations, and the minimum wage laws prevent people who are lower skilled workers from competing on the basis of price. So minimum wage laws hurt like high school students, formerly incarcerated people, and then people who might have conditions that make them like less productive workers, but they still have an interest in working. It's going to hurt those people the most. And it'll also hurt people who are victims of just unjustified labor market discrimination like racism. And so if you have a minimum wage law, it means that people who are already comparatively advantaged in the marketplace are able to take on more hours. It makes it so it's more worth it for them to occupy those lower wage jobs. And then it's going to shut out their competitors from maybe having a chance at getting those jobs by competing on the basis of price. And that's the kind of dynamics that makes me opposed to most of the things that you're calling labor justice. When it comes to unionization, fine, unionize. The thing that I'm opposed to when it comes to unionization isn't workers getting together and deciding to collectively exercise their economic freedom. It's the same thing with the minimum wage example or other examples, which is that they then try to get the government to prevent other people from competing against the unionized workers on the basis of price, like the national NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. It's not just saying, oh, everybody get together, talk union, coordinate on certain conditions within your shop. It's also calling upon the government to put its thumb on the scales to try to privilege union members over non-union members. And that's the issue that I'm against. When it comes to the contract stuff, ordinary contract law has provisions within certain kinds of contracts that don't require specific performance, only requires compensation for failure to provide the specific performance. So under no contract regime is the government ever going to say, you promised to mow Jessica's lawn and you decided it was too much work. You saw it and you were like, nope, this lawn is a mess. You actually have to go there with all of your weed whackers and mowers and do it. No, it would just say you need to pay her some kind of compensation for the delayed access to lawn care because you put a contract in saying that you would mow the lawn, you didn't do it. Pay a penalty for failing to provide according to the contract. So it's not as if having, freedom of contract with sex workers would require that people like have to engage in specific performance. It's just that, they might in some cases have to pay penalties or damages to people if they did make contracts that they try to get out of.
So should there be consumer protection laws for the customers? So, the one, as you say, is the example where the prostitute reneges. And so you might think that, one, you're entitled to any money that you paid over, but maybe you're also entitled to some kind of solatium for the dignity infringement. You sort of assume that the reason why they cancelled was that you're so undesirable that they won't have sex with you. And that's something that you should be compensated for. Should you be entitled to compensation for, let's say, any harms you endured at the hands of the prostitute? So you picked up a venereal disease or they left unwanted bruises on you, things like that. And then on the other hand, should there be any kind of basic conditions of work rules? So should you make it prohibited to enter into a contract where you're allowed to choke someone to the point of near death, or cut them or beat them or whatever it is that you think? Or do we say, look, as long as you're consenting under conditions of autonomy, whatever you want to do is entirely up to you and the state must have no hand in it?
Yeah, the second thing. As long as you're consenting under conditions of autonomy, that should be the conditions. And as for the consumer protections of the kind of dignitary harms or something like that, that's a great case for why you'd want to have some kind of private licensing or certification system. And so you could imagine, like, I have a lawyer, my lawyer's terrible, but I could like take it to the bar association and say like, hey, bar association, this lawyer was terrible. Like, you shouldn't certify this person as a good lawyer. He was so bad. Or my dentist, just bring those back in. Like, we have licensing organizations or private certifying organizations that kind of maintain a list of people who can like meet a certain level of quality. What I don't think should happen is that the unlicensed providers should just be totally shut out of the whole market. So, some places have licensing for sex workers, and, in England, you can get like a license to operate as a sex worker, but it's very arduous to do it, and you have citizenship requirements. And then that means that there's this kind of like black market of sex workers who lack access to a lot of the protections from the police and stuff because they're worried that they could get in trouble for unlicensed providing. And so you don't want the licensing to be legally required, but you do want there to be some kind of opportunity for licensing because consumers have an interest in it.
I mean, I would love to know what the British trade test looks like for being certified as a prostitute. I just imagine it would be comedy gold to see that process in action.
I remember when I was writing the book, I was looking at kind of like ethnographic accounts, and there was one account of women who were sex workers in England, and they were talking about working for the National Health Service. And it was like, pays way less, just as physically demanding. People are much more rude to you because they have a sense of entitlement to the services since they're not as grateful for it. And they were like, the National Health Service is our national pride. And the way that we treat health workers and med techs and assistants is just so awful. And then meanwhile, very similar work, better hours, better pay, and people are much nicer to us within the sex industry.
Interesting, during COVID, the Germans paid prostitutes who weren't able to run their businesses because they prohibited during the lockdowns. So they said, well, you're an important part of the economy and you deserve a payout like everyone else. Would you be in favor of something like an Uber system where prostitutes and customers can rate each other? And so prostitutes would know this guy's got a 2-star rating, sell your services at your peril. And similarly, certain people are only, 4.5, up to you.
I think it's in Sweden. There is an app. Oh, Switzerland. In Switzerland, there is an app called Choice, which is like that. It's supposed to be a sort of safer, both two-way verification system for sex workers and sex buyers in Europe. And that's like a great possible innovation. My impression is that the supply of clients is lower, that clients have an interest in not participating in that because they have concerns about privacy and anonymity with the verification processes. But it's if sex workers could coordinate around using that service, I mean, it offers a service for the sex workers that they would really value.
On that same note, in many labor markets, clients are encouraged to leave public reviews of workers. So what if that same logic is applied to sex work? Should clients be allowed to rate their experiences the way someone could if they ate at a restaurant and wanted to leave a 5-star review for their experience there and their server?
Totally. Free speech. I mean, I don't love rate my professor for sex workers any much more than I like it for professors, but it's just free speech, and it sucks because it's gonna be really unfair, or one person that has some kind of agreement. So take it all with a grain of salt, but I don't think you can censor people in talking about their experiences.
I think one of the great academic studies would be to take the rate my professor comments and the rate my prostitute comments, jangle them up and see if we can tell the difference. This person rode me really hard. Unclear, ethics or prostitution, I don't know. Part of what you mentioned in the book is that you wanted to hear from prostitutes and customers. How did that experience then color your position on the topic?
Oh, I just think that people have this view of sex work that it's totally outside of society, that it's not something that's continuous with ordinary life, but it's extremely continuous ordinary life. The way that people talk about their jobs as sex workers is just very similar to the way that they talk about their jobs in any other industry. It's things like, overtime pay, the cut with the manager, just ordinary questions about which shoes to wear. There used to be this blog of sex workers called Tits and Sass that was just a lot of kind of workplace, advice for people. And then for the customers, similarly, it's hard out there to find a partner for anybody. And it's just fully continuous with that. It's just, they're ordinary people. They're not necessarily, perverts or deviants or anything like that. It's people who are just curious about having a new experience or going through a phase of having a lot of work or loneliness. And there are definitely people with very derogatory views of women that you'll find on these forums of sex buyers. But you'll also find people with very derogatory views of women on any other internet forum that's predominantly men talking about women. So I don't think that's even that is distinctive to sex work.
So there's a paper I love by philosopher Hallie Liberto, and it's titled The Problem with Sexual Promises. And I've been thinking about your argument in relation to it. She essentially introduces the idea of overextensive promises. So they're promises that are so physically or emotionally invasive that even when made voluntarily, they shouldn't be treated as morally binding. So she argues, for example, promises to have sex or even refrain from sex in a monogamous relationship often fall into this category. So in such cases, she claims that promisees are morally obligated to release the promiser out of respect for the kind of discretion a person ought to retain over their body. So I guess to illustrate this, she uses the example of promising to donate a kidney. So even if someone voluntarily makes this promise, we typically think there's something problematic about holding them to it, not because they were necessarily coerced or because we think they made a bad decision, but because the nature of what's being promised is so intimate and physically invasive that a person should be free to change their mind without moral penalty. So I wonder if something similar could apply in the case of sex work. So even if someone consents freely to the act of sex and enters a contractual or employment relationship, could the act of sex itself involving direct physical access to one's body make that consent functionally similar to an overextensive promise? And in that case, would the client, the employer, or even the legal system have a kind of moral obligation not to treat their promises binding? Not because the worker lacks autonomy or judgment, but because what's being promised may fall outside of the bounds of what's promisable in the first place.
I don't think that there's some objective fact about the kinds of things that are promisable versus the kind of things that are not promisable, or, what's going to be a deal breaker for one person versus another. A thing that I often encounter in the sexual ethics literature, Verito, Tom Dougherty's work, things like this, is that there's often equivocations between what do we have moral reason to do versus what can we hold people to when it comes to conditions of liability, blame, any kind of moral sanctioning attitude. And of course, there's always moral reason to, let somebody out of a promise that they don't want to do. Sure. There's moral reasons to not have people be in a position where they're going to suffer some penalty for doing something when they've changed their mind. But that doesn't mean that there's no moral force to that initial promise in the first place, or that if you don't act according to those moral reasons, that the requirement is somehow canceled. And so the language of permissibility in this literature really equivocates between doing what you have most moral reason to do versus doing something within the realm of liability and sanctioning. And I think in the realm of liability and sanctioning, those deontic considerations, the fact that somebody really doesn't want to, that was a reason to not get into a position to be in that place in the first place. But once you are there, once you've made a promise, it is deceptive to then go back on the promise. That's just the ordinary ethics of deception, is you can't tell somebody you're going to do something and then not do it because it inhibits their ability to plan and count on you. And that way it's an affront to their autonomy. And for that reason, you're liable to some kind of blame or sanction within that domain. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be nice and let them out of it. But everybody already agreed that you should be nice to let people out of those promises. That would be a nice thing. But that doesn't translate to any of the deontic facts. And so it's kind of frustrating to me that people play on these intuitions around sex in a way that kind of ramps up the moral stakes of those kinds of arguments. But I just think that they're similar to all of the ordinary cases where, we have moral reasons to do stuff, but we don't have to in the requiring sense. And if we did, then that kind of an argument would rule out, for example, commercial surrogacy, gestational surrogacy, or just getting pregnant in general, any kind of long-term planning agreements between people, or military service, or working on a commercial fishing boat. There's a lot of stuff where you make a commitment to somebody and then they count on you to follow through on the commitment. And then because they counted on you for that, if you bail on the commitment, it's costly to them. They have grounds to resent you or to blame you for it. Maybe they shouldn't, but like that's a separate question.
I suppose there's an interesting question, as you say, whether you can hold them morally accountable. But can you, in the fishing boat case, if the person says, look, I signed up for 6 months on the fishing boat and at 3 months, and I just hate this job so much, I want to leave. And they say, no, like you can't leave. Sign a 6-month contract. It's going to be very expensive for us to go and, drop you back in your home country. And we are entitled to enforce the contract. And you might think the person who says, well, I'm here against my will, they can say, no, your will was you sign up for 6 months. That's what you're in for. So in the prostitution case, let's say someone says, I want you to sign up to be my romantic partner for 6 months. We're going to go off to a very romantic island. And after 3 months, I say, I don't want to do it anymore. Like the money was great, but this is just such a vile, disgusting experience with you. I hate your smelly breath and your stinky toes, and I'm out. You can say, no, like you signed up for 6 months, you made your promise, I'm holding you to it. Or do we think that there's an exception there and the person's allowed to bail and you're obliged to shift your life around and fly them back to their home country?
I mean, this is a question of whether contract law should demand specific performance again. And I think like in some ways the question is like favorable to my position because it's like no one actually does have a contract regime that demands specific performance. And so even in the fishing boat case, like, okay, then you pay for the Coast Guard to come and like rescue you from this boat. And then you have to pay back all of your wages that we've given you for up to this point, and also pay some kind of damage to the cost of searching to get someone else to come back on the boat. So like you can get off the boat, but it's like, same with the military. Like you can leave, but you're going to be like other than honorably discharged. It's like a whole thing. Like there's conditions that don't require specific performance in all of these cases, but it's like very, very, very burdensome. And I think that would be similar for the kind of sex work contracts that you describe. But then there's like the philosophical question, which is like, but like, should contract law be that way? Or should it be the case that like you really can contract for anything? And then, in principle, I think that it should be permissible for a person to make a contract to sell their heart, to like contractually sell their full physical person, to like end their lives. And so at that point, I think they can pretty much contract for anything in principle. It's your body, you own it, you can do what you want with it. The only consideration that's a little bit dicey on it is considerations of personal identity, where for very long-term contracts, you're effectively promising for someone who's psychologically dissimilar to you enough that it's a different person. And so you do want to have like some kind of re-upping on any kind of contract, even in principle, because of personal identity reasons. And that would be true for like marriage and mortgages too. But because contract law doesn't demand specific performance, we don't need to have that kind of personal identity refresh going on in the way that you would in principle if you allowed any kind of long-term contract.
Many fields require training, licensing, or like education to ensure professionalism. Should there be some kind of certification process for sex work? So should new sex workers be required or at least encouraged to take classes in things like boundary setting, STI prevention?
I think it'd be great if like, community colleges like had like a sex work certification like hospitality or whatever. But I don't think any of that should be legally required. And you could even have different licensing schemes, the way that we have with like chiropractic versus osteopathic versus allopathic medicine. There could be different kinds of schemes for different kinds of emphasis on like different sorts of sex work. That sounds great. Like I think that's one place that like markets are going to be like pretty helpful for people is like giving them different kinds of certification and human capital development that'll be useful for them in their jobs. I don't think that the government should require it for doctors. Like I don't think that a medical license should be required to practice medicine, much less a sex work license being required to practice sex work.
So one strain of argument is that it's good for women to have restrictions on prostitution. Those who advocate for that position don't necessarily have to take the view that you should restrict the sale of gay male sex. If they do hold that position, do you think that there's some inherent prejudice in it one way or the other, that you think either women or infants who require some special protections? What do you make of those who hold that position?
I think that what's going on when people hold that position is that they think that the work is better for male sex workers. Like they have a hypothesis in their head that they think that men in general are going to have like more preferences for like having higher rates of sex or something. They're more likely to want more sex or something. Like there's some kind of essentialist view about men being different than women that's going to make them feel that for these essentialist reasons, male sex work is less likely to be autonomy limiting or non-voluntary or exploitative. I don't think that's a warranted assumption, even though I do think that there are going to be differences on average between men and women. So I think that differences in taste and talents on average between men and women explains why so many sex buyers are men and so many sex workers are women. However, within the sex work industry, the people who become sex workers are likely going to have unusual tastes and talents around a preference for sex work compared to other kinds of work, which would make them more similar to what a male sex worker would be like in terms of also having an unusual taste and talent for sex work, sexual labor. And so, population averages are going to explain differences in supply and demand in the sex market, but we shouldn't read from those population averages that the people who become sex workers as women are going to themselves be very similar to the population average of women. I think that that's the mistake that they're making.
Just to follow up on sex workers being encouraged to take classes and receive certification, do you think that maybe clients should also be encouraged to take a class on purchasing services?
Well, yeah, I don't think any of that should be required. But I do think it would be like helpful to have a certification. And sometimes you'll see these like date me ads that people will put out where they have like testimonials from their friends and they'll be like, date my friend Tim. Like he's great. Like he can play the banjo and he's like makes really good pancakes or something like that. And then that's like a signal to people. It's like, oh, a third party has certified Tim that he's like kind of a cool guy, right? Then you could imagine that there was like could be in the same way that some dating apps have like a preliminary certification, that there could be markets for sex work that have preliminary certification on the client side as well. And I don't know why clients would do that, but like maybe it could give them access to a different kind of experience or something. Sure. Like if we allowed these markets, I imagine that there'd be like a massive amount of diversity of experiences and certifications, and we could get way more information about people. The problem with the current state of prohibition partly is that it prevents workers and clients from getting the kind of information that they're interested in about the people that they're trying to find. But if we bring the market into the open air, we can have much more effective screening of that information.
So part of the reason why people seem to have a distaste for prostitution seems to be their views about sex, but it seems that the other part of it is their views about money. So some people think that there's something sinister about money, and so they want to prohibit, selling blood, for example, instead of donating blood. So people are happy for you to donate sex. That's fine. You can have sex for no cost, but as soon as you start adding a dollar value to it, then people get kind of upset. So I gather your view is going to be that, if you can sell your heart, I'm assuming that there's nothing you can't sell, and that market should be available in all places. Do you think that shifting attitudes towards money would be a good way of solving a lot of people's prissiness about sex?
Yeah, I think that the thing about the money that people are worried, it usually does reveal that they actually had an issue with the underlying thing. And so I think that people who say like, oh, I don't believe that you should be allowed to, sell sex, I often find if you really scratch the surface is that they don't think that people should be sexually promiscuous either. So if you talked about a woman who is, had sex with 60 guys in a month, it's a high number. I think that the people who think that sex work should be illegal would also be a little bit judgmental towards that. But the fact that it's a market exchange makes them think that there's more of a pretext for government intervention because they think that the government has the authority to like regulate the economy. And so I think this goes back to this thing where people think, following like Mill or whatever, that like trade is a social act that's like fit for regulation. And for some reason, they think that once something enters into the economy, that gives public officials or voters some kind of entitlement to have a say in regulating choices that they already disagree with. But the thing that's doing the work is that they already disagreed with it, but they got that it would be like super out of line for the government to be like logging everybody's sexual choices and finding out that a woman exceeded 60 sexual partners in a month and then like knocking on her door to like come and penalize her in some way. They get that that would be invasive and gross and wrong, even though part of them kind of wants to prohibit that. But then once it's in the marketplace, they're like, oh, bet now we can just like send the cops to her door because like she's exchanging money. Or it's like, well, what happened there? Like the mistake is to think that the government has the authority to regulate the economy in this way, because it's obviously being used as a way of just controlling people's private decisions about their own bodies. Because the only reason that this is the kind of economic exchange that you would want to regulate is because you disapprove of that bodily choice. It's not the exchange of money that was making them mad. It's the promiscuity.
Well, Jess, I want to say thank you for such a fabulous discussion. That's one of these things where I think people feel very strongly about it, and having a cool way of analyzing it and sort of extrapolating not just your views on prostitution, but about freedom generally and about the role of the state. It's such a nice case study for thinking that we need a lot more freedom than we generally grant our co-citizens. So I very much appreciate it. And if you're listening to the show, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section on Spotify or on YouTube. I'm recording there.